There is a photograph the Spanish royal household released on a quiet afternoon in 2023, a small girl in a school uniform, flanked by two parents who had not yet become king and queen. Almost nobody looking at that photograph could have guessed what the following 3 years would hold. A parliamentary oath, a military commissioning, an ocean crossing on a tall ship built in 1927. A meeting with a pope. A university acceptance letter that quietly closed one chapter of her life and opened another. Today we're tracing the real, documented, on-the-record moments that have defined Leonor, Princess of Asturias, heir to the Spanish throne, not the invented palace intrigue you'll find on lower-budget channels, but the actual public record, moment by moment, in her own words and the words of the institutions around her. If you've ever wondered how a teenager becomes a future head of state in real time, in front of cameras, this is that story. Let's start where her adult public life legally begins, October 31, 2023, her 18th birthday. Under Article 61 of the Spanish Constitution, an heir to the throne who comes of age must swear an oath of allegiance to the king and to the Constitution before the Cortes Generales, Spain's parliament. This isn't ceremonial theater the palace invented for good television, it's a binding constitutional requirement, the same mechanism that has applied to every heir since the 1978 Constitution was ratified. Leonor stood in the chamber of the Congress of Deputies, in full military dress, and pledged loyalty to the king and fidelity to the Constitution and the laws. It was the first time in Spanish history that a female heir presumptive, not merely a symbolic princess, but the direct constitutional successor, took that oath in her own right. The moment carried tension the palace didn't try to hide. Some lawmakers from Republican and separatist parties boycotted the session, a reminder that Spain's constitutional monarchy, restored only in 1975 after the Franco dictatorship, still exists inside a country where monarchist sentiment is not universal. Polling from the University of Murcia around that period consistently showed a real split in public opinion, not the manufactured hysteria you'll see on tabloid channels, but a genuine, decades-old political fault line about the monarchy's place in a modern parliamentary democracy. Leonor's speech that day acknowledged the responsibility rather than shrinking from it. She spoke about understanding the significance of the moment and the duties it placed on her. It was measured, it was brief, and by every account from journalists in the chamber, it was delivered without a visible tremor, remarkable composure for an 18-year-old reading from a script in front of the nation's entire political class. That same week, she received the medals of the Congress and the Senate, formal recognition of her new constitutional status as Princess of Asturias in the fullest legal sense, not just a title she'd carried since childhood, but now an active, sworn role in the machinery of state. 16 days earlier, on August 17, she had already made a decision that told us more about her approach to the crown than any speech could. She entered the General Military Academy in Zaragoza to begin a structured, three-branch military education, a program formalized under Royal Decree 173/2023, the legal instrument that laid out exactly how the heir to the throne would train across the Army, Navy, and Air Force over 3 years. This wasn't a photo-op deployment. It was full immersion, barracks, drills, academic coursework in military science, physical training standards applied uniformly to every cadet regardless of rank or birth. Her father, King Felipe VI, had walked the same path decades earlier, and the parallel was deliberate. In a 2023 joint statement, Felipe and Queen Letizia described the training as both valuable in itself and essential preparation, building a sense of duty, they said, and readying her for the representational responsibilities that would eventually fall to her as head of state. It's worth pausing on that phrasing, because it tells you how the institution itself frames the monarchy in the 21st century, not divine right, not inherited mystique, but duty, service, and preparation, spelled out in explicit constitutional and administrative terms. The Zaragoza chapter culminated on July 3, 2024, at a commissioning ceremony that drew the full royal family and Spain's military leadership. King Felipe personally presided, and the symbolism of a father commissioning his daughter, the same father who had once stood exactly where she now stood, was not lost on anyone in that courtyard. She had completed her army phase. From there, the training moved to sea. the Naval Military School in Marin and, more famously, the training ship Juan Sebastián de Elcano, became the next stage of her education. If you know anything about Spanish naval tradition, you know the Elcano isn't just any vessel. It's a four-masted topsail schooner, commissioned in 1927 and named for the navigator who completed the first circumnavigation of the globe after Magellan's death partway through the voyage. Officer cadets have trained aboard it for nearly a century. Leonor's deployment on the Elcano wasn't a ceremonial cruise, it was months at sea, transatlantic legs, watch rotations, navigation training, and the kind of close-quarters shipboard discipline that has shaped generations of Spanish naval officers. Accounts from officers and fellow cadets who served alongside her during that period consistently described someone who integrated into the routine rather than standing apart from it, eating in the same mess, standing the same watches, subject to the same expectations. For a program explicitly designed to prepare a future monarch, the emphasis on ordinary discipline over royal exception was, itself, a kind of statement. The final phase brought her to the General Academy of Air and Space in San Javier, in the region of Murcia, training as a pilot alongside her Air Force cohort. And on July 10, 2026, that chapter closed in front of cameras and dignitaries at a graduation ceremony that marked the formal end of her 3-year military education. King Felipe presented her with the Grand Cross of Aeronautical Merit with White Distinction, one of the Spanish military's highest honors, awarded for exceptional service and achievement, not handed out as a courtesy title. She had now completed training across all 3 branches, Army, Navy, and Air Force, the full sequence laid out in Royal Decree 173/2023, 3 years after she first arrived at Zaragoza as an 18-year-old cadet. If you're new to this channel, this is exactly the kind of moment where lower-effort royal content either invents a scandal or skips the substance entirely. We do neither. We're going to keep tracing the record, because the next chapter of Leonor's public life took her somewhere very different, into rooms with heads of government, religious leaders, and, most recently, the world's biggest sporting stage. In June 2026, the Spanish royal family welcomed Pope Leo XIV to the royal palace in Madrid, with Leonor and her younger sister, Infanta Sofia, standing alongside their parents for the audience. Vatican protocol around dress for such meetings has its own quiet history, the tradition of noblewomen wearing a black mantilla, the lace veil, during papal audiences, a custom rooted in Catholic court etiquette that goes back centuries and has been observed with variation by royal families across Europe. The meeting itself was diplomatic in nature, part of the ordinary rhythm of state visits and Vatican relations that Spain, as a historically Catholic monarchy, maintains as a matter of course. It wasn't a personal audience granted as a favor, it was protocol, carried out at the level you'd expect for a head of state's family, with Leonor present in her formal capacity as heir. The following month brought one of the more substantive public speeches of her young career. On July 14, 2026, at the Princess of Girona Awards, held at Barcelona's Gran Teatre del Liceu, Leonor closed the ceremony with remarks that went further than typical formal remarks read from a card. She'd spent the evening meeting each of the award winners individually before speaking, among them Hatem Azari, founder of an organization built to expand sports access for young people in one of Barcelona's neighborhoods, and another honoree recognized for using technology to help people, in Leonor's words, unlock their own dignity and growth. Her closing address focused on talent, curiosity, and purpose, and she made a point of saying that her role models are not famous people. It's a small line, but it's consistent with a pattern journalists covering her have noted since her very first major public speech back in 2019, a preference for substance over spectacle, and public remarks that read as genuinely drafted around her own priorities rather than generic royal appearance boilerplate. Barely a week later, on July 15, she made a quieter but historically resonant stop, the Roman ruins at Empúries, on the Catalan coast, one of the most significant archaeological sites in Spain, where Greek and Roman settlements layered on top of each other going back more than 2.5 millennia. The visit was folded into the same Princess of Girona Awards programming, but it reflected something else worth noting about how her public role has been shaped, a deliberate inclusion of Spain's cultural and historical patrimony alongside the political and military duties, the kind of cultural stewardship that heirs to European thrones have quietly performed for generations, usually with far less scrutiny than the tabloid-friendly appearances get. And then, just days after that, on July 8, actually preceding the Girona ceremony chronologically, Leonor was present in Zaragoza for a genuinely new milestone, not for herself, but for her sister. Infanta Sofia delivered her first major public speech in that setting, with Leonor by her side. For a family whose two daughters have spent their entire lives being compared, contrasted, and occasionally pitted against each other by outside commentary, the public record here tells a simpler story, an older sister standing in support as the younger one steps into her own public voice for the first time. Royal historians who study sibling dynamics in constitutional monarchies, and there's a long, well-documented body of that history, from the House of Windsor to the House of Orange, will tell you that how an heir treats a younger sibling with no claim to the throne is often read as an early signal of temperament. So far, the documented pattern between Leonor and Sofia has been one of visible support rather than rivalry. Now, before we move into the summer of 2026 and the biggest single crowd she's ever stood in front of, if you're finding value in getting the real, sourced timeline instead of the speculation you'll find elsewhere, this channel exists specifically to cut through that noise. Hit subscribe now, because we're about to cover the moment that put Leonor in front of more live viewers than any other appearance in her public life, and there's a lot more of this kind of grounded, fact-checked royal history coming. Summer 2026 brought Leonor's most globally visible appearance yet, the World Cup final, held on American soil, where she and Infanta Sofia joined their parents on the pitch-adjacent royal box, alongside a roster of heads of state and government that included the sitting President of the United States and Spain's Prime Minister, Pedro Sánchez. For a young woman whose public role, up to that point, had been defined largely by military ceremony, parliamentary protocol, and cultural appearances within Spain, this was something categorically different, a global sporting event, broadcast to hundreds of millions, where the Spanish royal family's presence was itself a form of soft power diplomacy, reinforcing Spain's standing on the world stage through football, the country's most universally shared cultural export. When the team returned home with the trophy, the celebration continued at the Zarzuela Palace, where the royal family hosted a reception for the World Cup champions, a tradition in Spanish public life that dates back through multiple tournament wins, but one that, for Leonor, marked her first time presiding over that kind of celebratory state occasion as an adult heir rather than a child observer. The contrast is worth sitting with. The same young woman who, 3 years earlier, was standing at attention taking a constitutional oath in a parliamentary chamber, was now standing in a palace reception room congratulating footballers on a world championship. That range, from solemn constitutional duty to national celebration, is, in miniature, the actual job description of a modern constitutional monarch. By early August, the pace slowed, deliberately. The family decamped to Majorca for their traditional summer stay at the Merivent Palace, and on August 4, Leonor, Sofia, their grandmother Queen Sofia, and their parents hosted the annual dinner for regional authorities, a long-standing fixture of the Spanish royal calendar that welcomes representatives from institutions across the Balearic Islands. It's a lower-key event by design, more about continuity and regional relationship building than headline moments, but it closed out what had been, even by Leonor's recent standards, an extraordinarily dense stretch of public milestones: a military graduation, a papal audience, a major awards speech, a historic archaeological visit, her sister's public debut, and a World Cup final, all inside a matter of weeks. What comes next has been confirmed by the palace and isn't speculation. In September 2026, Leonor will begin studies in political science at Carlos III University in Madrid. After 3 years in military academies and aboard a naval training ship, this marks her first sustained period of civilian academic life since finishing her international baccalaureate at UWC Atlantic College in Wales, back in 2023. It's a deliberate sequencing choice by the institution: military formation first, then an academic grounding in the political and governmental theory that will underpin decades of constitutional duty still ahead of her. Political science, specifically, tracks closely with what her role will actually require: understanding the mechanics of a parliamentary system she is constitutionally bound to remain above, in the sense that the Spanish monarchy is designed to be strictly nonpartisan, reigning without ruling, a principle set out explicitly in the 1978 Constitution and reinforced by every monarch and heir since. It's worth stepping back, at this point in the story, and putting these moments in the context of what actually makes Leonor's position unusual, even among Europe's remaining monarchies. Article 57.4 of the Spanish Constitution requires that any marriage the heir enters into be authorized by the king in the Cortes Generales, under penalty of exclusion from the line of succession, a real, binding legal constraint that shapes her personal life in ways most 20-year-olds never have to consider, and one this channel has covered in depth precisely because so much speculative content gets that mechanism wrong or invents drama around it that the actual law doesn't support. Her parents' own 2004 wedding, between then Prince Felipe and Letizia Ortiz, a divorced television journalist with no aristocratic background, remains the most significant modern precedent for how much flexibility the institution can actually accommodate when it wants to, a reminder that constitutional constraint and total lack of personal agency are not the same thing. And there's the more difficult, unavoidable backdrop, the legacy of her grandfather, King Juan Carlos I, whose 2014 abdication amid corruption allegations, and subsequent self-imposed exile to the United Arab Emirates, reshaped the modern Spanish monarchy's relationship with public trust before Leonor was even a teenager. Every poll on monarchist sentiment in Spain since 2014 has to be read against that history. It's part of why the current institution, under Felipe, and increasingly visible through Leonor, has leaned so heavily into a narrative of duty, transparency, and earned legitimacy rather than inherited entitlement. The military training, the parliamentary oath, the university enrollment in political science rather than a softer or more ceremonial course of study, these aren't random choices. They read, consistently, as an institution trying to rebuild credibility one documented, verifiable milestone at a time. Which brings us back to where we started, a photograph of a schoolgirl who had no idea what was coming. In under 3 years, Leonor has sworn a constitutional oath before a divided parliament, completed training across 3 branches of the armed forces, crossed oceans on a century-old training ship, stood before the Pope, delivered speeches that critics on both sides of Spain's monarchist divide have had to acknowledge were substantive rather than scripted fluff, supported her sister's first steps into public life, celebrated a World Cup championship on the world's biggest stage, and is now, this September, walking into a university lecture hall as an undergraduate for the first time since she was a teenager in Wales. None of it required invented palace intrigue to be compelling. The real record already is. If this kind of grounded, sourced royal history is what you come here for, there's more of it every week. Leonor's university years are just beginning, and there's a lot more of this story still to be written. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next one, when we go inside exactly what a political science degree at Carlos III means for a future head of state, and why the curriculum choice itself might be the most quietly telling decision of her public life so far.